History Secrets.
In the year 1945, an unexpected discovery took place in the interior of Egypt. Near the city of Nag Hammadi, farmers digging in search of fertilizer found a large clay jar buried in the ground. Inside that container were several ancient codices, manuscripts written in the Coptic language. These texts had remained hidden for centuries. What researchers discovered in that jar would profoundly change the study of the history of early Christianity. The Nag Hammadi codices contain dozens of ancient texts, gospels, spiritual treatises, dialogues attributed to Jesus and the disciples. These writings belonged to currents of religious thought that had been almost completely forgotten over time. Many of them were associated with traditions now known as Gnostic. These communities developed spiritual interpretations different from those that became dominant within the Christian Church. To understand the importance of this discovery, we first need to understand the context in which these texts were preserved. To understand why these manuscripts were hidden in the desert, we need to return to the early centuries of Christianity. During that period, many Christian communities had different interpretations of the teachings of Jesus. Some groups emphasized the importance of the tradition transmitted by the apostles. Others developed more symbolic and philosophical spiritual reflection. Among these currents were communities that are now called Gnostic. The word gnosis means knowledge, but in this context, it refers to a specific type of spiritual knowledge. For many Gnostic traditions, salvation did not depend only on faith or religious practice. It was linked to the discovery of an inner knowledge, a spiritual awakening that would reveal the true nature of the soul. Within these communities, texts emerged that presented dialogues between Jesus and his disciples. In these dialogues, Jesus often reveals deep teachings about the origin of the world, the nature of the Spirit, and the path to spiritual liberation. Some of these texts were preserved precisely in the codices found in Nag Hammadi. Among them is one of the most surprising Gospels ever discovered, the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the most fascinating texts found among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. Unlike the Gospels of the New Testament, it does not present a narrative about the life of Jesus. There are no accounts of birth, miracles, or crucifixion. The text consists of a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Each presents brief teachings, often enigmatic. At the beginning of the manuscript, there is a phrase that reveals the tone of the text. Whoever finds the interpretation of these words will not experience death. This type of language reflects the Gnostic emphasis on the discovery of inner knowledge. Many of the sayings present in this gospel have parallels with phrases found in the canonical Gospels, but others present ideas that do not appear in any New Testament text. For example, some sayings suggest that the kingdom of God is not only a future event, it would be present within human consciousness itself. This spiritual perspective made the Gospel of Thomas an extremely important document for scholars of early Christianity. But it is only one of many texts preserved in the Nag Hammadi collection. In addition to the Gospel of Thomas, the Nag Hammadi codices preserved many other remarkable texts. Among them are writings known as the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, and the Gospel of the Egyptians. These documents present deep spiritual reflections on the nature of reality, the soul, and the universe. In many of these texts, the material world is described as an imperfect reality, a kind of prison for the human spirit. According to these traditions, the true goal of existence would be to awaken to a higher spiritual reality. Within this vision, Jesus appears as a teacher who came to reveal this hidden knowledge. He teaches the disciples to recognize the divine spark present within each person. This type of teaching differs significantly from the emphasis found in the canonical Gospels. In the texts of the New Testament, the message of Jesus is often associated with the arrival of the kingdom of God and the transformation of human life. In Gnostic texts, the emphasis lies on spiritual awakening and inner knowledge. This difference reveals that early Christianity was much more diverse than we often imagine. Among the texts found in Nag Hammadi are also writings that present symbolic narratives about the creation of the world. One of the most well-known is the Apocryphon of John. This document presents a detailed vision of the origin of the universe according to certain Gnostic traditions. According to this narrative, the material world would not have been created directly by the supreme God. It would have arisen from a series of spiritual emanations. Within this system appears a figure called the demiurge. This character would be responsible for the formation of the physical world. In Gnostic tradition, the demiurge is often described as a being who believes he possesses absolute authority, but who in reality does not fully understand the higher spiritual reality. This interpretation presents a cosmology very different from the one found in traditional biblical tradition. It suggests that the material world is the result of an imperfection or an error in the spiritual order. For scholars, these texts offer a unique window into understanding the diversity of religious ideas that circulated in the early centuries of Christianity. They show that the debate about the nature of God, creation, and salvation was much broader than the canonical texts reveal. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts also helped historians better understand the debates that took place within early Christian communities. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, different interpretations of the message of Jesus were circulating. Some communities emphasized the apostolic tradition preserved in the churches. Others developed more complex philosophical and spiritual systems. These currents eventually came into conflict. Christian leaders such as Irenaeus of Lyon wrote works criticizing Gnostic teachings. They argued that these interpretations distorted the original message transmitted by the apostles. At the same time, the texts found in Nag Hammadi show that these communities possessed sophisticated literary traditions. They produced deep reflections on the nature of the soul, the universe, and salvation. For a long time, historians knew these ideas only through the criticisms made by their opponents. But the discovery of Nag Hammadi allowed the texts of these communities to finally be studied directly. When the Nag Hammadi codices began to be translated and studied, researchers quickly realized the historical importance of this discovery. For the first time, it was possible to read directly texts that represented alternative traditions within early Christianity. These manuscripts revealed that the early centuries of the Christian faith were marked by a much greater diversity of ideas than had been imagined. There were different interpretations about the nature of Jesus, about the creation of the world, and about the path to salvation. The formation of the New Testament and the dominant Christian tradition took place precisely in this environment of debates and theological disputes. Over time, certain interpretations were recognized as orthodox. Others were rejected or ceased to circulate widely. It is possible that the manuscripts found in Nag Hammadi were hidden precisely in this context. Some scholars believe that monks or members of Christian communities buried the codices to preserve them, perhaps fearing that they would be destroyed during periods of religious conflict. Thus, the texts remained hidden in the desert for more than 1,500 years. Today, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts are considered one of the most important discoveries for the study of early Christianity. They did not directly change the texts of the New Testament, but they profoundly transformed the way historians understand the religious environment in which Christianity emerged. These documents show that, in the early centuries, there was a great diversity of interpretations about the message of Jesus. Different communities preserved different traditions. Some emphasized faith and apostolic authority. Others highlighted the search for inner spiritual knowledge. The discovery of Nag Hammadi opened a window into these traditions that had remained hidden for centuries. It allowed researchers to directly compare Gnostic texts with the canonical Gospels, and thus reconstruct more precisely the intellectual and religious landscape of the ancient world. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this discovery is precisely this: the manuscripts buried in the desert not only preserved forgotten texts, they also revealed the complexity of the early communities that sought to understand who Jesus was and what the meaning of his message was. Thus, the mysterious jar found in Nag Hammadi ultimately became one of the most important keys to understanding the history of Christianity. The past does not disappear. It remains recorded in ancient monuments, in forgotten texts, and in stories that have crossed centuries. Each discovery reveals a new enigma, and each enigma brings us closer to the truth. Subscribe and continue investigating the hidden secrets of history, because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
In ancient religious traditions preserved outside the traditional biblical canon, there is a text that has sparked great fascination among scholars and readers. A manuscript known as the Book of Enoch. This document presents an extraordinary narrative about events that would have occurred long before the flood described in the book of Genesis. It speaks of angels who abandoned heaven, beings called watchers. According to this ancient tradition, these angels descended to the earth and entered into direct contact with humanity. But what makes this narrative even more intriguing is the type of knowledge that these beings are said to have shared, secrets that, according to the text, should not have been revealed to humans. These teachings included techniques of metallurgy, knowledge of warfare, practices of enchantment, and astrological interpretations. The Book of Enoch presents these events as part of a period of profound transformation in the ancient history of humanity, a moment when the boundaries between the celestial world and the human world would have been broken. But to understand this narrative, we must first return to the central figure of this ancient text, Enoch, a mysterious figure briefly mentioned in the book of Genesis itself. The figure of Enoch appears only briefly in the biblical narrative. Even so, a small mention aroused great curiosity throughout history. Genesis chapter 5, verses 23 and 24 presents Enoch as a man who walked with God. The text states that all the days of his life were 365 years. And then it adds an enigmatic phrase, Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer found, because God took him. This description is extremely unusual within the biblical narrative. Most characters in the book of Genesis have their lives concluded with a simple phrase, and he died. But In the case of Enoch, that conclusion does not appear. This absence sparked great interest in later religious traditions. Many interpreters began to imagine that Enoch had received special revelations. Some ancient texts developed this idea much more extensively. They describe Enoch being taken into the heavens. There he would receive visions about the structure of the universe, the destiny of humanity, and the secrets of the spiritual world. These traditions eventually formed what we now know as the Book of Enoch, a collection of ancient writings that greatly expand the brief reference found in the book of Genesis. But within this book appears a story that would become one of the most intriguing in ancient religious literature, the story of the Watchers. In the book of Enoch, the Watchers are described as a group of angels who originally belonged to the celestial world. These beings observed the earth and followed the development of humanity. But, according to the narrative, something unexpected happened. Upon seeing the daughters of men, these angels began to desire to live among humans. The text states that they made a collective decision. They would descend to the earth and take wives from among human women. The Book of Enoch describes this moment with great drama. The angels are said to have gathered on the summit of a mountain called Hammadi. There they made an oath, a pact, to remain united in this decision. Among these angels appears a leader named Semihaza. He feared that the others might withdraw because of the consequences of their decision. So he proposed that all of them commit through a collective oath. Thus, none of them could turn back. This episode marks the beginning of a deep rupture between the celestial world and the human world. From that moment on, according to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers begin to live among humans. But the coexistence between these two realities would produce unexpected consequences that would profoundly transform the history of humanity. After descending to the earth, the Watchers did not only unite with human women. According to the Book of Enoch, they also began to transmit knowledge that had previously remained hidden. These teachings are described as secrets of heaven, knowledge that human beings were not yet prepared to receive. The text mentions several of these forms of knowledge. Some Watchers taught the art of working with metals, forging weapons, making swords and armor. Others taught techniques of ornamentation, the use of jewelry, the making of cosmetics. One of the most frequently mentioned names in this context is Azazel. According to the Book of Enoch, he revealed to humans the knowledge of weapons of war, and also taught practices related to vanity and the manipulation of appearance. Other angels revealed knowledge of astrology, interpretation of celestial movements, enchantments, occult practices. Within the narrative of the Book of Enoch, these teachings are presented as a problem. They accelerated human development, but they also increased violence, corruption, and moral disorder. Thus, knowledge that seemed to bring progress ended up contributing to a period of great chaos on the earth. According to the Book of Enoch, the consequences of the presence of the Watchers on earth were not limited only to the knowledge they transmitted. The text states that from the unions between these angels and human women, extraordinary beings were born, giants. These giants are identified in the tradition as the Nephilim, beings of strength and size far greater than ordinary humans. The Book of Enoch describes the growth of these giants in striking terms. They consumed enormous amounts of food. They quickly exhausted the available resources. When there was no longer enough to sustain them, they began to destroy everything around them. According to the narrative, the giants began to act with extreme violence. They devastated cities. They consumed animals. And in some accounts, they even attacked humans themselves. The earth became filled with violence. This scenario reflects a description that also appears in the book of Genesis. Genesis, chapter 6, verse 11, states that the earth was corrupted before God and filled with violence. Within the tradition of the book of Enoch, this corruption is directly related to the actions of the Watchers and their descendants. The world would have entered a period of profound disorder, a time that would prepare the stage for a decisive event, divine judgment. Faced with the violence spreading across the earth, the book of Enoch describes a moment when the cry of humanity reaches heaven. According to the text, the archangels observe what is happening in the human world. Among them appear names well known in biblical tradition. Michael, Nicananus, Undi Udinanu, Almagostice, Diemadiuions, Cabuhinu Ilinanidisia, Raphael, and Uriel. These celestial messengers witness the growing corruption caused by the Watchers and the Giant's Eye. Then they present this situation before God. The response presented in the narrative is a judgment against the angels who abandoned their original position. According to the book of Enoch, Raphael receives the mission to punish Azazel. He must bind him in a desolate place and cover him with stones until the day of final judgment. Gabriel receives another task. He must bring about the destruction of the giants, causing the giants themselves to turn against one another. Michael receives the mission to imprison the Watchers who led the rebellion. These angels would be chained in subterranean depths until the moment of final judgment. Thus, the narrative describes the restoration of order after the rupture caused by the descent of the Watchers. But the judgment does not end only with the punishment of the angel. It also prepares the stage for an even greater event, the flood that would transform the history of humanity. After describing the punishment of the Watchers, the book of Enoch presents a decisive moment in human history. According to the text, the corruption caused by the giants and by the forbidden knowledge had reached an extreme level. Violence spread across the entire earth. In this context, God announces that humanity will face a great judgment. This judgment also appears in the book of Genesis. Genesis, chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, recounts that God tells Noah that the end of all flesh had been determined. The earth was filled with violence. Therefore, it would be purified by a great flood. Within the tradition of the book of Enoch, this event has an even broader dimension. The flood would not only be a response to human corruption, it would also be related to the consequences of the rebellion of the Watchers. The presence of the giants and the spread of forbidden knowledge would have profoundly altered the balance of creation. Thus, the flood appears in the narrative as an act of restoration, an attempt to begin again, a moment in which the order of the world would be rebuilt after a period of great disorder. But even after this judgment, the stories about the Watchers and the giants would continue to circulate in ancient traditions. These narratives pass through centuries and remain preserved in manuscripts that still arouse curiosity and debate today. When modern scholars analyze the book of Enoch, they seek to understand not only the content of these narratives, but also the historical context in which these texts were written. Most researchers believe that parts of the book of Enoch were composed between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ. This period corresponds to the era known as the Second Temple in Jewish history. During that time, various religious and intellectual currents reflected deeply on themes such as the origin of evil, the role of angels, and the destiny of humanity. The book of Enoch emerges precisely within this environment of intense literary and theological production. Many scholars observe that the narrative of the Watchers offers a symbolic explanation for the presence of violence and corruption in the world. Instead of attributing all these problems solely to human actions, the text suggests that a spiritual rupture influenced the course of human history. This idea also appears in other ancient religious traditions. It reflects an attempt to understand why the world seems marked by conflict, suffering, and disorder. Within this perspective, the Watchers represent the transgression of boundaries established between different dimensions of creation, a rupture that would have triggered profound consequences. But at the same time, the narrative itself also speaks of judgment, restoration, and hope. When we gather all these traditions, we perceive that the Book of Enoch occupies a very unique place within ancient religious history. It is not part of the biblical canon of most Jewish and Christian traditions. Even so, it exerted great influence during many periods of history. Some texts of the New Testament show familiarity with ideas present in this book. For example, the letter of Jude mentions a prophecy attributed to Enoch. Jude, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, cites a tradition that directly reflects passages preserved in the Book of Enoch. This detail indicates that certain early Christian communities were familiar with these narratives. Throughout the centuries, the Book of Enoch has continued to arouse interest because of its detailed descriptions of the celestial world. It speaks of angels, divine judgments, secrets of the universe, and the final destiny of creation. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this text is the way it expands a brief passage found in the book of Genesis, the story of the Nephilim and of the angels who are said to have crossed the boundary between heaven and earth. These narratives do not offer definitive answers about the origin of evil or the mysteries of antiquity, but they invite the reader to reflect on limits, responsibility, and the consequences of crossing boundaries that perhaps should never have been crossed. Thus, the Book of Enoch remains one of the most fascinating documents preserved in ancient traditions, a text that continues to raise questions about the forgotten secrets of the spiritual history of humanity. Throughout history, civilizations have risen, disappeared, and left clues scattered through time. Some of these clues have been discovered, others are still waiting to be revealed. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these mysteries. Subscribe and continue exploring history with us, because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
Mary Magdalene is one of the most well-known figures in the Christian tradition. Even so, her story remains surrounded by questions and different interpretations. In the Gospels of the New Testament, she appears as a close follower of Jesus, a woman who witnessed decisive moments in the Christian narrative. Luke, chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, mentions Mary Magdalene among the women who accompanied Jesus and helped support the group of disciples. The text states that 7 demons had been cast out of her. That detail deeply shaped the way her figure would be remembered throughout history. Mary Magdalene also appears in one of the most important moments of the gospel narrative, the resurrection. John, chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, describes Mary Magdalene visiting the tomb of Jesus After the crucifixion, she finds the tomb empty, and according to the account, she is the first person to witness the risen Jesus. This unique position led some scholars to call her the Apostle of the Apostles. But over the centuries, different traditions began to interpret her figure in different ways. Some of these interpretations profoundly transformed the image of Mary Magdalene. To understand who she really was in ancient Christian traditions, we need to examine these different narratives. In the Gospels of the New Testament, Mary Magdalene appears in decisive moments of the narrative about the life of Jesus. She is present during the crucifixion. Matthew, chapter 27, verses 55 and 56, mentions Mary Magdalene among the women who were watching the events from a distance. These women had followed Jesus from Galilee. They were present when many of the disciples had already dispersed. This detail shows that Mary Magdalene was part of the circle of the most faithful followers. She also appears again at the moment of the tomb. According to the Gospel accounts, Mary Magdalene observes the place where the body of Jesus is laid. This explains why she returns to the tomb on the third day. The episode of the resurrection further reinforces her importance. John, chapter 20, verse 16, describes the moment when Jesus calls Mary by her name, Mary, and then she recognizes him. This encounter made Mary Magdalene the first witness of the resurrection within the Christian narrative, an extremely significant role within the tradition. But over time, her figure ended up being reinterpreted in very different ways. Some of these interpretations arose centuries after the biblical texts died. Over the centuries, the image of Mary Magdalene began to change within certain Christian traditions. One of the most well-known interpretations emerged from the association between three different figures mentioned in the Gospels. Mary Magdalene, the sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. These three figures appear in different contexts within the New Testament, but in certain periods of Christian history, they ended up being confused or unified into a single character. This interpretation became especially influential after a sermon delivered by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century. In that discourse, he suggested that Mary Magdalene could be identified with the sinful woman mentioned in Luke, chapter 7. From that moment on, the image of Mary Magdalene became frequently associated with the idea of a repentant sinner. This interpretation deeply shaped Western tradition for many centuries. But it is important to note that the Gospels of the New Testament do not explicitly state that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. This association emerged later within certain theological interpretations. In Eastern Christian traditions, for example, Mary Magdalene has always been seen differently. She is remembered mainly as a faithful disciple and witness of the resurrection. In addition to the traditions preserved in the Gospels of the New Testament, there are also ancient texts that present Mary Magdalene in an even more significant way. Among these documents is a manuscript known as the Gospel of Mary. This text was probably written between the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Although it is not part of the traditional biblical canon, it offers an interesting perspective on the position of Mary Magdalene in some early Christian communities. In the Gospel of Mary, she appears as a disciple who receives special teachings from Jesus. After the departure of Jesus, the disciples find themselves confused and uncertain. It is Mary Magdalene who takes the initiative to comfort them. According to this text, Mary shares with the other disciples a spiritual vision that she had received. This revelation describes the journey of the soul and the challenges faced after death. But not everyone easily accepts her authority. The text presents a moment of tension between Mary and some of the disciples. Peter questions whether Jesus would really have entrusted such important teachings to a woman. Then Levi intervenes. He states that if the Savior considered Mary worthy of these revelations, no one should reject her. This narrative shows that some early Christian traditions saw Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader, someone capable of transmitting profound teachings within the community. In addition to the Gospel of Mary, other apocryphal texts also mention Mary Magdalene in a significant way. Among them is the so-called Gospel of Philip. This manuscript belongs to a collection of writings associated with Gnostic traditions preserved in ancient codices found in Egypt. The Gospel of Philip presents symbolic reflections on spiritual and sacramental themes. Within this text, Mary Magdalene appears as a close disciple of Jesus. In a well-known passage, the manuscript states that Jesus had a special bond with Mary. She is described as someone who deeply understood his teachings. Some modern interpretations have suggested that this text might indicate a very close personal relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. However, many scholars observe that the Gospel of Philip uses highly symbolic language. Terms such as companion may carry spiritual meanings within the Gnostic tradition. They often indicate closeness in knowledge or in spiritual understanding. Thus, the text may be highlighting Mary Magdalene as a disciple who understood deeper teachings. This interpretation reinforces an idea that appears in several apocryphal texts. The figure of Mary Magdalene is a prominent follower within the circle of disciples. When historians analyze the different traditions about Mary Magdalene, they perceive that her image was shaped by various interpretations over the centuries. In the Gospels of the New Testament, she appears as a faithful disciple, a woman who followed Jesus from Galilee, who remained present during the crucifixion, and who became the first witness of the resurrection. These elements are consistent in the canonical texts. In the apocryphal Gospels, Mary Magdalene often assumes an even more prominent role. She appears as someone capable of understanding profound spiritual teachings. In some accounts, she becomes a kind of mediator between Jesus and the other disciples. These differences reflect the diversity of traditions that existed in the early centuries of Christianity. Various communities sought to interpret the life and teachings of Jesus in different ways. Within this context, the figure of Mary Magdalene ended up acquiring varied meaning. In some traditions, she was remembered as a penitent. In others, as an exemplary disciple. And in certain ancient texts, as a bearer of spiritual revelations. Throughout history, the figure of Mary Magdalene continued to arouse great interest within the Christian tradition and also in the field of historical studies. Modern researchers seek to return to the earliest texts to understand the role she truly played. When we closely examine the canonical Gospels, we perceive that Mary Magdalene appears in extremely important positions within the narrative. She accompanies Jesus during his ministry. She remains present at the moment of the crucifixion, and she becomes the first witness of the resurrection. These three elements indicate that her presence within the circle of followers was significant. Many scholars consider that this role may reflect the importance of certain women in the early Christian communities. In the texts of the New Testament, there are various references to women who actively participated in the religious life of these communities. Within this context, Mary Magdalene may have been remembered as a particularly devoted disciple. The way her image evolved over the centuries also shows how religious traditions reinterpret historical figures as new narratives and interpretations emerge. Thus, Mary Magdalene remains one of the most fascinating figures of early Christianity, a character situated between history tradition, and interpretation. When we gather all these traditions together, we perceive that Mary Magdalene occupies a very special place within the history of Christianity. In the oldest texts preserved in the New Testament, she appears as a faithful follower of Jesus, a woman who was present at decisive moments. She witnessed the crucifixion, she observed the tomb, and she was the first to find the empty tomb on the morning of the resurrection. These elements already indicate a position of great importance within the Christian narrative. Over the centuries, different traditions began to interpret her figure in various ways. In some theological currents, she was associated with the idea of repentance and transformation. In other traditions, especially in apocryphal texts, she appears as a disciple who received profound spiritual teaching. These differences reveal the diversity of perspectives that existed in the early Christian communities. Perhaps the true meaning of the story of Mary Magdalene lies precisely in this richness of interpretations. She is not just a character from a single text. She is a figure that spans multiple traditions, a witness to a decisive moment in the Christian narrative, and an example of how history and tradition can intertwine over time. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.